Good evening and welcome to it. It's me, Sibs Matiela, and of course that means that you are tuned into the Private Property Podcast, brought to you proudly by privateproperty.co.za, because we love to connect you to the heart of property, which is why we have this podcast. We tell you everything and anything you need to know along your property journey. And because I don't have the answers, or all of the answers at least, we just bring in experts who know exactly what they're talking about to help both you and I learn more about this property game. Today, we are talking about what you need to know before you launch into a subdivision and about subdivisions in general. We're speaking to Denoon Sampson, who's the managing director of Denoon Sampson Ndlovu Inc. Welcome to the show, Denoon. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks so much. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Listen, first of all, let's talk about subdivisions. What would qualify as a subdivision?
Basically, one has to apply to the council to do a subdivision in terms of its land use policy. And the Joburg City Council, that's what I'm talking about, and probably the other municipal metros have a policy, a guideline to ensure the right type of subdivisions in certain areas.
So what would you say are the most common mistakes people make when it comes to starting a subdivision project?
Basically, the most important thing is to check, to have a bigger picture inquiry into the locality, into the unique physical features of the property to be subdivided. For instance, there's got to be access to the road. That's the first thing. There's no point in doing a subdivision if you subdivide the property and you can't, and there's no way to get to the road. So that's the first thing. The first thing is basically that, and the second thing is to get a full breakdown as to what the costs are, because the costs of subdivision are many and they're quite a lot. So one needs to get a town planner to give a very, very itemized and detailed breakdown, because basically if one basically asks the town planner what will it cost, he'll give you his fees that he will charge to do the application. But that is not the beginning, that's not the end of the story. There are lots of other fees that are incurred afterwards and during the process.
I'm glad you bring up all of the fees and sort of getting the town planner in and all of these other people, because that leads me to my next question about, you decide, okay, I've got this property, let me subdivide this house, maybe make a rental income, maybe get some students in, or, whatever you have you. And I suppose what I need to know is, who do you speak to and what's the first port of call when you now launch into this project? Surely, you've got to make some kind of assessment, or, there's a step-by-step sort of process.
Yeah. So basically, most town planners in the area will know exactly what the rules and the policy of the council is per each area. So the first port of call is to just phone a town planner, a reputable one, and he'll be able to look up in his records and to tell you over the phone whether or not a subdivision would be approved in a certain area. So that's the first thing. So it's a simple thing just to make an inquiry by telephone. And if he says yes, it'll be granted in these sort of circumstances. Then one does a formal instruction to the town planner to get him to do a formal application to the council. And that requires sketch plans and a policy, and it requires a compliance with the zoning of the area, and one needs to basically submit a sketch plan to the council, and the whole process can take between 12 and 18 months for completion.
Wow.
So it's actually quite complicated. The other initial thing is, in the beginning, one needs to get an engineer services opinion to assess the feasibility of connecting into the council's sewer system and stormwater management system, because that is what happens at the very end. And one would need to know in the beginning whether or not there'll be complications in trying to connect into the sewer system and the water management system at the very end, because sometimes it's quite complicated to do it at the end. So one needs to get an upfront opinion from an engineer before one starts.
So who would you say, like, who's the main person you need permission from in this process?
Well, basically, you really need to employ a town planner to do an application on your behalf to the council, because it's a whole big complicated process. And one needs to firstly understand and to get a town planner to tell you what the costs are. And he needs to break it down to all the different facets of the procedure. So I'll just give you a view of what some of the costs would be. A town planner might charge between 60,000 and 110,000, depending on the unique complexity of the subdivision. A land surveyor needs to draw diagrams and get them approved by the Surveyor General. That might cost 25,000. A conveyancer might charge 18,000. And then one of the requirements of a subdivision is that the council will require an engineering endowment contribution to be paid towards the infrastructure charges. This can be between 60,000 and 200,000 as an upfront payment into the council before they will agree to allow the final lodgement of the subdivision in the deeds office. So then that's an important aspect. And that then thereafter, after the subdivision is improved, one has to connect electricity and water meters. And so a 3-phase electricity meter would cost about 85,000. A single-phase meter would cost about 15,000. Then there'll be a cost of an engineer to connect to water mains and sewage. And the only benefit of all of this is that the transfer duty, which was paid in the very beginning, will not have to be paid when one registers the newly created subdivided portion. So it's a complicated process. And the other thing that people do need to know about is that there are a whole pile of multiple approvals required to get this whole system in place. It might require rezoning, which a town planner would do. It might require removal of restricted conditions in the title deed. Some title deeds historically are drafted in such a way as to prevent subdivisions and require rezoning. So those conditions historically now probably are obsolete. So one would have to get the lodgement in the deeds office to get those difficult conditions taken out of the title deed. And then the first thing that the town planner will do is to apply and submit an application to the council. And the result will be a provisional consent, whereby it's a policy decision from the municipality. Yes, they will agree to a subdivision. And there's a very strict proviso and condition that all of the terms and conditions of the subdivision will have to be complied with. And it normally requires a whole lot of interdepartmental permissions and consents from the council, such as one would have to get. So one has to arrange for all the subdivisions in the council to approve, such as the Joburg Water, Joburg Roads Agency, the City Power, Building Control, Picket Up Sewage. They all have to give their prior consents to the main secretariat in the council. And once all of those permissions and consents have been granted, the final overriding consent is issued by the council. It's in terms of Regulation 34. And they endorse the power of attorney, which is a lodgement in the deeds office to create and register the existence of a subdivided portion. So that is the conveyancer will draft a power of attorney, and that will be submitted to the council, and they will endorse the power of attorney to say that all the subdivision and sub consents have been complied with. And then that gets lodged in the deeds office. So that's really the whole sum of the story. And so the point is that there are many, many consents that have to be granted. So one needs to make sure that one doesn't get muddled up with the consents, because a land surveyor has to get the surveyor general, the government surveyor general, to consent to and approve the size and the shape of the subdivisional diagram, because each newly created subdivided portion has to be reflected on a land survey diagram, which gets lodged in the deeds office. So once we had a woman who basically was phoned up by the land surveyor to say that, oh, the subdivisional diagram's been approved, and she thought that the whole subdivision had been approved, and she wanted to know when she would get paid, because she thought that the whole transfer had been approved, and it hadn't been. This is only one consent in the whole process of many. So one needs to be very careful in drafting a sale agreement which is conditional on a subdivision being approved, because one needs to put in the right terms and conditions in the sale agreement to make sure that the sale is conditional on the overriding and the final consent being granted. So it's all a complicated process. It's costly, and it takes a long time. And that's really the sum of the whole story.
Denoon, it does sound incredibly costly, and I'm glad that you brought up some of the numbers. What are some of the sort of hidden cost implications, or the general cost implications, when it comes now from the SARS end, or anything else you need to pay attention to now, money-wise, when it comes to subdividing your property?
There's no tax involved in doing a subdivision other than a payment to the municipality of what they call an engineering endowment contribution. So basically, it's all the costs that I've mentioned. And basically, so what is really significant is that if you ask a town planner, which you have to really use, what will it cost? He'll tell you what his fees are, but he won't really tell you what all the other costs are, such as engineers, the land surveyor's cost, the surveyor general's cost. And also the other thing is hidden costs are the existing mortgage bond. So most people have an existing mortgage bond over the property of which they want to subdivide, and one has to get permission from the bondholder to agree to have a part of the property that was bonded to be taken out from underneath the bond. And so that's the first step that one normally does. Normally, a land surveyor, a town planner or conveyancer would apply to the bondholder to get permission to take out a portion under the bond. And so in a rare situation is where the bank could request the seller to pay an amount into the bond to reduce the indebtedness of the bond, because originally the bond was granted over the whole value of the property. And if you're taking out some of the portion, the value of the property which is there to secure the indebtedness is reduced. So therefore, on the rare occasion, the seller might be requested to pay into the bond to reduce the indebtedness and to make sure that the amount that the bank is covered for is equalized. The other thing about in engineering endowment costs are that the fees increase every year. And so one has to make sure that one pegs the payment of the endowment cost to the council. The other thing is that if one applies to the council for a subdivision and doesn't proceed with it, and you rather decide to sell the whole property, the council will peg a charge against the property itself, and that charge will remain there until someone wants to do a transfer. So basically, if you decide not to go through with your subdivision, but you have applied for it, and you sell the property, the next person will still have to pay the council that endowment, that engineering charge. So that's a difficult problem, and it's hidden. Other costs would be the creation of a perimeter wall, which is going to separate the portion from the existing property, and that can be quite costly. And then there is the issue about a servitude. So if one has to drive across a neighbor's property to get to the road, one needs a notary public to register the servitude, and sometimes a diagram might be required. So that might cost about 12,000 Rand. And then in some cases, there's a panhandle which goes up from the road to the different portions up into the property. And that requires an agreement with the neighbors and the other people, because some people will share the panhandle and they'll access their properties from the panhandle into their own properties. So it's a shared driveway, it's a shared private driveway, and there has to be an agreement between the neighbors about who's going to maintain the driveway, agreement about the security gate, and maintenance and management of the panhandle driveway. Those are significant issues that would have to be dealt with. And basically, the other point about a subdivision, it's a really unique undertaking, and it basically is unique to the shape of the land and the locality. So these costs are basically estimates, and they depend on the uniqueness and the complexity of the undertaking. So it's all quite complicated. It takes a long time, but the benefit of a subdivision is that you still are able to reside in the area that you originally chose to move into, and you basically have reduced costs on your rates and taxes in the future. You also reduce your risk of a security, because most properties that are subdivided are big ones, and so one reduces the cost of having the property after subdivision. So you can still live there in a smaller piece of property, and you can rent out the subdivided portion or build another house on it. So what we did in the past was to subdivide properties in Craig Hall and then sell off the portion and then get paid from that. So that's one of the benefits of subdividing.
So before I let you go, Denoon, obviously it sounds like there's a lot of benefits here, but also a very tricky and costly process just to get to a subdivision. So if it's something that I'm considering doing with my property, what is one piece of really, really vital advice that you would give me?
Well, it's basically to insist that a land surveyor itemizes all the different transactions involved in the thing from the beginning to the end, and for him to give an estimated breakdown, because he comes across those costs from the different service providers. That is probably the most crucial thing that you need to explore before starting on the adventure.
Denoon Sampson, who's the managing director of Denoon Sampson Ndlovu Inc. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you so much for joining us on the Private Property Podcast today.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Listen, that's all we've got for you this evening. We'll see you next time on the Private Property Podcast. I'm Sibs Matiela, and I'll see you soon.